9 verses. Here we go. Verse 12 says the first woe is past. There's 2 more woes coming. Everything is bound by God's purposes. Read on. Then the 6th angel blew his trumpet, and I heard a voice from the 4 horns of the golden altar before God, saying to the 6th angel who had the trumpet, "Release the 4 angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates." Now, since this voice emanates from the altar, it can't be anything but God. It is God. That's the only one who has the authority to be at the altar, is God. And so God is saying, release the angels that are bound. If an angel is bound, by the way, that's not a good angel. That's a demon. So these are fallen angels, but they are bound somehow at the Euphrates, not in the abyss. Why at the Euphrates? No. I keep saying that. I mean, this passage is really difficult. It's really tough. I'll give you a couple of ideas that I've been presented to me in all of my reading and research and study of this. The Euphrates was the boundary line for the Roman Empire at the time of the writing of this revelation. It was the dividing line, therefore, in terms of how the Roman world thought of East and West. And so maybe that's why they're bound there, because they're about to unleash catastrophe. The barbarian hordes are on the other side of the river Euphrates. That's a possibility. But we first see the Euphrates in Genesis chapter 2, where it's named with 3 other rivers that emanate and come from the waters that originate in the Garden of Eden. And so in that sense, perhaps there's some sort of symbolism with the Euphrates as the dividing line between life and death. Before the inhabitants of the garden, that is Adam and Eve, were rejected by God and ejected out of the garden, they were able to drink of that water, but afterwards it was only the Euphrates. I don't know. This is all stuff that's posited by people that are trying to figure this out. Maybe it's the dividing line between life and death then, between blessing and curse, because before there was blessing in humanity, and afterwards there was only curse. Maybe it's the dividing line between obedience and sin. Maybe it has something to do with the Tower of Babel. That's also thrown out there, which we think the plain of Shinar somehow straddled the Euphrates, and so therefore the Tower of Babel is somewhere along the Euphrates somewhere. We're just left to speculate. Nonetheless, here these angels are, let's just keep it to what it says, bound at the Euphrates, bound at this metaphorical or actual dividing line. Let's keep it going. Verse 15. So the 4 angels who had been prepared for the hour, the day, the month, and the year were released to kill 1/3 of mankind. Now, I know that your eye is immediately drawn to the last line of that verse in verse 15, that last phrase. Resist that. We'll get to it eventually. I want you to look at something else. It says the 4 angels had been prepared. They've been prepared for the hour, the day, the month, and year of their release, which means God has a plan. These angels were in rebellion against God. That can't be according to God's plan, can it? And one of the kids asked me this week, as we were talking about sin and the consequences of sin on Thursday, he raises his hand and he says, wait, I don't understand. If God knows everything, then didn't he know that Adam and Eve were going to sin? And I looked at him and I said, that's how you know there's no plan B. There is no plan B. God has a plan. It's been the plan from the beginning of time. It will always be the plan. It never changes because God is sovereign. God knows everything. He's outside of time. He sees all of the spectrum of time, and he knows what's going to happen before it happens. So God has a plan, and these angels were in rebellion against God, and that's why they were bound. And yet, even in their rebellion, they can't help but serve God's purpose. Isn't that amazing? There should be great comfort in that. You may feel, as we've been discussing throughout this year, as we've been having catastrophe upon catastrophe befall our church in terms of the people that have passed away this year, you should feel great comfort in that. There's nothing haphazard going on. It felt haphazard to me. Maybe it did to you, but it wasn't. Not any part of it has been. You may feel like, well, there can't possibly be any reason for why I'm going through what I'm going through. Job had to wrestle with that. I demand an answer, God. I've done nothing wrong. Why is this happening to me? Can't possibly be an answer. And God says, did you make any of this? I did. So I can tell you exactly what the answer is. So there is an answer. That's what we see here. These angels, these rebellious angels, are being held for the exact hour that God has designed for them. So whatever you're going through, there is a plan for it. It's part of a larger plan that is directed by God. And you say, well, if that's how God directs his plan, then I don't want any part of him. Hey, welcome to Psalm chapter 2 again. Shaking your fist at God. How dare you? You can't do that. I'm me. That doesn't even make any sense. But God has planned out the very year, the very month, the very day, the very hour of every event of your life. We give ourselves the illusion of control, but somehow in the midst of all of that, he allows you the opportunity to choose him, and it all fits within his plan. How does that work? Let me say it for the fourth time. I don't know. But it does. So yet again, these woes are the removal of God's restraint. Their whole purpose is to mete out the punishment on the final third that we see in these trumpets. A third of all of the green stuff on earth, a third of the water, a third of the light, now a third of humanity left on earth. Keep in mind that we already lost a fourth of humanity back in the seal judgments. So combine a third of those remaining with the fourth that was already taken, and now we've removed about half of the earth's population through judgment. How do you kill a third of the earth's population? Well, verse 16. The number of mounted troops was twice 10,000 times 10,000. I heard their number. This is how the third of humanity are going to be killed. 2 times 10,000 times 10,000. If you're not a mathematician, that's 200 million. By the way, the largest number listed in Scripture. It's right here. John says, I know this is right, that there were 200 million troops, because I couldn't have possibly counted them if I wanted to, but I heard it. Somebody mentioned that's how many there were, so that's how many it is. You know, some of you remember back in 1965, the Chinese government announced that their military had eclipsed the 200 million number. Oh, the fodder that provided for preachers. Now we know this army, where it comes from. It comes from China, they said with such great assurance. There is a massive war, to be sure, in which 200 million mounted troops are invested in the war, but I cannot say for certain that it's China that they come from. It's a fantastic description. And so some people say, well, this is just John's way of describing modern implements of war. He didn't really understand what he was looking at. I mean, in verse 17, he says he doesn't understand it. This is how I saw the horses in my vision and those who rode them. Right? Isn't that basically an assent to saying I don't understand what I'm looking at? Maybe. They wore breastplates, the color of fire and of sapphire and of sulfur, and the heads of the horses were like lions' heads. These lions, they keep coming up. Fire and smoke and sulfur came out of their mouths. By these 3 plagues, a third of mankind was killed by the fire and smoke and sulfur coming out of their mouths. For the power of the horses is in their mouths and in their tails, for their tails are like serpents with heads, and by means of them they wound. Now, if you read Hal Lindsey, you know that he says, these are modern implements of war. These are probably missiles that John just doesn't have any way of understanding what they are. And I would respond to that of, again, we're falling into the modern day trap of trying to solve spiritual problems through worldly solutions, through physical solutions. Somehow this spiritual issue must be bullets and bombs. Some interpreters want to say that this is some sort of massive world war. The 4 bound angels actually are 4 rulers leading 4 armies. Maybe that's true. It's possible. To be fair, half of the resources I read to try and research this passage, they all agree with that. Certainly a battle that could muster 200 million soldiers would have the ability to kill a third of the Earth's population. That's certainly true, but I suspect If we went nuclear, as Hal Lindsey suggested back in the 70s, that we would not lose a third of the world's population, we would lose all of the world's population. So I don't know. That's all I'm telling you. Again, for the fifth time, I don't know. Don't you see why I love this passage so much? It's so much fun to try and explain. The other half, remember I mentioned half of the commentaries I read agreed with Hal Lindsey, and the other half of the commentaries all say simply that this is just a description of demons. And I can see that as well in this passage. I mean, just look at the description. It's obviously very fantastic. Certainly brings a cohesiveness to the vision as a whole. The demons are released and they start following, the demons are released from the pit, they start following Apollyon. So it only follows that 4 more archangel types who are fallen would also have at their command a host of demons. It's possible. But I'm going to come clean and just say, I don't know. I want to be honest with you as I approach this passage. Regardless of how it comes about, obviously a massive catastrophe happens. A third of humanity is wiped out. And you would think the obvious conclusion for us, reading this from our distance, from our cozy chairs, would be, well, if you saw all this happen, you would think, okay, then they start to repent, right? They finally wise up and they realize they can't argue with God, that if they do, bad things are going to happen. But no, read on in the passage. If anything, humanity doubles down against God.